Good morning, and I'd like to welcome everyone today to the CAN Europe Pre-Doha press briefing. And today, as our speakers, we have Wendel, who's the director of CAN Europe. He's going to talk to you about the future of the Kyoto Protocol and the next legal agreement, which will be called the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, and also a bit about what's going to happen before 2020 when the new agreement will go into effect. We also have with us Sven Harmeling, who's team leader of international climate policy at Germanwatch, who are very active CAN Europe members. And he's going to talk a little bit about climate finance and adaptation and what we can expect in Doha on those issues. So we'll go ahead and get started. For anyone watching online, we'll want to let you know that you can send in questions either via Ustream, we sent out the link through our website, or you can send us questions via Twitter to @CanEurope and use the hashtag is CanDoha, and then we'll be able to respond to questions that way as well. So I pass the floor over to Wendel.
Thank you, Vanessa. Good morning, everybody. So I've been given very limited time to talk about all the issues that were highlighted by Vanessa. So I will go extremely briefly through them, and of course you can raise further questions if you want. One of the main items on the agenda for Doha is the Kyoto Protocol. In Durban, countries agreed that they would accept the amendment of the Kyoto Protocol in Doha so that the second commitment period could start. That still has to happen, and it is actually fairly crucial that that also happens in Doha. Not necessarily because the Kyoto Protocol has a huge importance in terms of the mitigation effort, in terms of the level of the commitments that will be in a second commitment period. You all know that the number of countries will be fairly small. It's the European Union, Switzerland, Norway. Since recently, Australia also has said that they will join the second commitment period, and probably Ukraine and maybe some other countries. But countries like New Zealand, Japan, Canada, and the United States have already said that they won't be taking targets under a second commitment period. And not only are the number of countries limited, but also their level of ambition in the pledges that they've made to be under a second commitment period will be fairly low, including the EU's 20% emission reduction pledge. I will talk more about the level of mitigation later on. The main meaning why it's important to have a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol agreed in Doha and amendments adopted is because of the legal nature of the Kyoto Protocol. It's the only legal binding agreement we have. It provides not only with a compliance mechanism, but it also provides common accounting rules so that all countries account in the same way for the emissions they made and for the emission reductions they achieve. And it is fairly important if we go towards a new legal agreement to be hopefully negotiated by 2015 and starting after 2020, that it builds further on those fundamentals that are currently in the Kyoto Protocol. And if not continuing a second commitment period would probably put in question whether countries will be able to use the architecture that they already have. And it's in particular important for Europe, because Europe has many of those rules in place. It has these accounting rules, etc. And it would only increase the level playing field if, by extending the current Kyoto Protocol and putting it into the new legal agreement, Europe would play at the same league as all the others. And in that sense, also the discussions that are currently taking place on the proposal for the mechanism for monitoring and reporting are of crucial importance for Europe. And we definitely call upon the member states to be much more proactive on common accounting rules, also in Europe, as that will help them to put forward their arguments for common accounting for all. There are a number of issues that need to be dealt with regard to the Kyoto Protocol, which includes the issue of AAU, so the carryover or non-carryover of non-use emission allowances. There's the length of the commitment period, whether it's 5 years or 8 years, and there's the issue of application, because even if an amendment of the Kyoto Protocol gets adopted in Doha, it should start the 1st of January 2013. It's clear that no way there will be sufficient ratifications through the parliaments of those countries, but countries can find ways to overcome that and ensure that implementation starts the 1st of January. So that's the Kyoto Protocol. Secondly, Doha will be important in terms of really starting up the negotiations on the new protocol that should come into force in 2020 or 2018, depending on the length of the commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. It is crucially important that in Doha countries agree on kind of a path forward, on an action plan, on how they will ensure these negotiations move forward. We believe that just starting up without clear milestones is not going to work. So countries should agree what will we do in 2013, what will we do in 2014, what will we do in 2015, and set clear deadlines for when they want to achieve progress on specific elements. It's clear that one of the main important elements that will come across all of the issues that will be on the negotiation is the issue of equity. You probably remember that the last night in Durban there was quite a bit of a discussion about the issue of equity, and it's very clear that for developing countries, if they will engage with ambitious commitments in a new agreement post-2020, that the issue of who takes what responsibility and on what basis will need to be dealt with. And we strongly urge upon countries in Doha to ensure they have a clear work plan on how to tackle the equity issue, as it is kind of a precondition for progress on any other issue. So that brings me to the third issue. We need to ensure the KP continues. We need to ensure the negotiations on the Durban platform of enhanced action moves forward, but we also need countries to do something about what is called easily the ambition gap or the mitigation gap, where we compare the pledges being made in Copenhagen and Cancun for the 2020 emission reduction targets, and we compare those with what is needed to keep temperature rise below 2 degrees, then we see that there is a gap between what countries are prepared to do and what is needed. Countries agreed both in Cancun and in Durban that this gap needs to be tackled. Unfortunately, we see most countries coming empty hands to Doha. The EU is hoping that we make some progress on some of the sectoral issues in Doha, which includes international aviation and shipping. It includes the issue of HFCs that are being dealt with under the Montreal Protocol. It includes issues like fossil fuel subsidies, etc. It is highly unlikely that we will get real progress on those issues, because most of these issues are not a responsibility of the UNFCCC. So Doha at best might acknowledge that something needs to be done and ask other UN institutions to make progress. Some countries are also hoping that a number of the countries that have not made pledges yet, neither in Copenhagen, neither in Cancun, neither in Durban, that they will come up with pledges. And there's a number of countries with high level of emissions that are part of that. Countries like most of the OPEC countries, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc. Some of them really amongst the top 20 of emitting countries in the world have not made pledges yet. And if they would make pledges, that could of course in a way tackle to a certain amount the ambition gap. But what we really need, and what we really call countries to do, is to look at the level of their ambition when coming to Doha. And in particular, given that we are Can Europe, in particular the European Union could use a revisiting of their current targets. As you know, the European Union would propose a 20% target to be inscribed in the second commitment period. if we are looking, and the Commission just 2 weeks ago published a report on the progress of implementation of the Kyoto targets for the first commitment period, so the period 2008-2012. And if you look there at the average emission reductions that the Commission is projecting that the EU would achieve for the period 2008-2012, so the average for those 5 years, it is exactly 20%. So in a way, the Commission is now projecting that they will be over the period 2008-2012 where the European Union wants to be in the period 2013-2020. So actually, the EU's commitment under the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol will equal what they are already doing now. So there is no real progress there. We know that the EU will do more. We know they will go beyond 20%. They have just adopted the Energy Efficiency Directive. They have launched proposals on cars efficiency to improve before 2020. They have just launched a proposal for the revision of the F-gas Directive, which will increase emissions or reduce emissions before 2020. And on Wednesday, they are going to launch some ideas for the adjustment of the emission trading scheme, which will also lead to additional emission reductions prior to 2020. So what kind of a strategy is it that the EU is using by coming to Doha with a target that is way below the policies that they actually will implement? And we believe that for the EU, it would be much more smarter to take the leadership role again on this issue, go beyond the 20% and actually drive ambition forward, not only for the EU, but also in all other countries. I want to leave it like that.
Okay, thank you very much for this invitation and for the opportunity to provide you with some insights where we see the discussions going, in particular around climate finance, but also in adaptation to climate change. Let's start with climate finance. I think generally there's no doubt that the role that climate finance, that means finance delivered from developed countries to developing countries for climate action, is quite crucial for the years to come. Many developing countries have already initiated action. They have partially developed low-carbon development plans and a number of nationally appropriate mitigation actions. But also in the area of adaptation, they have started to undertake a lot of actions. And in order to implement these at the scale required, if we look at the ambition gap that Wendel already addressed, we of course need the provision of sufficient climate finance, and in particular the scaling up of climate finance. You may be aware that in Copenhagen a couple of years ago, heads of states committed to provide $30 billion for the period 2010 to 2012, the so-called fast-start finance period. And this is now coming to an end. There have been a lot of discussions and also analyses whether this commitment has been fulfilled or not. You can have some discussions about it. I think the most important point for the future is that we need to ensure that climate finance is growing beyond 2012. And there we are running in a difficult situation in Doha, because so far no country has made any quantitative pledges for the time beyond 2012. There has been some vague statements over the last months where some countries, some developed countries said, well, climate finance will continue, be sure. But of course this is not sufficiently reliable for developing countries to further scale up their actions. That means what we definitely require in Doha is serious considerations on how climate finance will be scaled up. There is a commitment by developed countries to provide in 2020 $100 billion per year. And of course, you can draw a linear line from 2013 to 2020, and then you have an idea how climate finance would have to be scaled up over the next years. But so far there's limited willingness among developed countries to put really figures on the table. And what we would require from Doha is, let's say, at least an interim target for 2015. That would be very helpful. And of course some pledges by some countries at least for the next years. For example, I'm coming from Germany. I know that in the German budget there are already allocations for climate finance. It still has to be approved by the parliament, but this will happen before Doha, and so we expect Germany as one of the countries who are in a position to do so, put figures on the table how much they would scale up the climate finance over the next, let's say, at least the next 2 years. But of course we need more. As I said, an interim target for the period 2013-2015, which would be, let's say, appropriate for this scaling up, would be in the order of 60 billion US dollars from the current 30 we had over the last 3 years. Of course, it's a difficult situation. Within the EU, we know that the EU is largely divided over this. There are now a number of countries which are, let's say, becoming poorer and poorer. The US is, of course, very difficult in terms of climate finance. But it's, of course, also inappropriate and adequate by developing countries that they need this assurance that climate finance is really being scaled up. So that's a particular challenging issue in Doha. Linked to this is, of course, the Green Climate Fund, because in order to build up the Green Climate Fund in a manner that it can really help play a powerful role and help developing countries to go to more low carbon and climate resilient development path, we also need substantial pledges into the Green Climate Fund. And the figure that is agreed by many NGOs within CAN and beyond is that by 2015 we would need 10 to 15 billion in the Green Climate Fund US dollars. Of course, the Green Climate Fund has just started its work and it will take some more time to be able to disperse the money, but without having this assurance of a certain scale of funds, you cannot really design the fund in a way that it can deliver the change that we need. Apart from that, the Green Climate Fund will not be, it's my perception, a very big discussion in Doha, because much of the work around the fund is now provided, or the responsibilities with the Green Climate Fund board. There was a decision 4 weeks ago that Korea will host the Green Climate Fund in the future. You may have heard about this. I don't expect big discussions that this will be opened up in Doha. Of course, there may always be surprises, but given the general agreement for this decision, I think it's just going to be approved. And there are some more other technical issues in climate finance on the agenda, which I can elaborate on if you're further interested. In terms of adaptation, adaptation to climate change is, of course, in particular important for the least developed countries and the small island states. The overall scale of the challenge is closely linked to what Wendel already has elaborated on, the level of mitigation ambition. Of course, the next 20 years of adaptation of the impacts of climate change, we cannot really impact on by mitigation because it's a longer term process. But if we're not able to scale up mitigation ambition, we will run into a world of 4 degrees and maybe more temperature increase in this century, which will definitely surpass the adaptive capacity of many regions and countries in the world. So what is it that COP18 in Doha can do about it? There are basically two bigger issues on the agenda. The one is the so-called loss and damage. This is something which, a term which you should keep in mind because it's becoming bigger and bigger. And basically the loss and damage of climate change we are talking about is those damages and impacts which already go beyond what we can avoid through mitigation or even through adaptation. I've been involved in a project where a partner institution has done a number of case studies in these developed countries, and these already show that loss and damage is happening today. People are trying to adapt, but there are already a number of negative impacts, like for example, loss of coastal lines from erosion, from sea level rise, even loss of houses, loss of lives, a number of impacts. So the loss and damage is already there, and it's going to become bigger. And in Doha, there will be discussions around whether, or let's say first around the next steps that under the UNFC are going to be taken to build up an international response to loss and damage. And this also involves, of course, scaling up mitigation and adaptation, but even also beyond. And there will be substantive and potentially controversial negotiations whether to establish an international mechanism to address loss and damage, because that's a demand from many developing countries, because they see that with a very loose response, this problem will be so big and that they can't really deal with it. There are a number of needs in terms of assessing loss and damage and the risk in the future, and also exchanging experience, but also providing funds for finding adequate responses to loss and damage. Of course, there will also be extreme responses like migration. There will be areas where migration will be the only option, and that's another difficult issue. But we hope that, that Doha will at least make substantial progress, that loss and damage is going to stay on the agenda, and that the international community is really tackling this problem in addition to what needs to be done in mitigation adaptation. It's not either or, but unfortunately it's too late to avoid all impacts of climate change. The second bigger issue, and then I'm coming to an end, is support for a new process which has been launched in Cancun 2 years ago, which is the development of longer-term national adaptation plans, in particular for least developed countries, because these countries experience more and more impacts from climate change, and in order to find the right and workable development path, they need to factor in what can they do to address the impacts of climate change. It's affecting the food sector, it's affecting the water sector, it's affecting ecosystems, and many of the least developed countries are, of course, very much relying on these factors, also in economical terms. And Doha will, on the one hand, discuss or probably approve some technical guidelines how these countries can develop these national adaptation plans, so I don't expect a lot of controversy around that. But it should also approve the funding modalities, the support modalities for these national adaptation plans. And scaling up the support for these is, of course, also an important task for the next years to come, because we need also these plans to get an idea what are the needs of these countries in the post-2020 world in terms of making their development adapted to the climate impacts that are expected. And all this happens, of course, on the background of this severe extreme events we had just a couple of weeks ago in the US and the Caribbean over the last years. And just a final word, which I think is important, that a couple of years ago, climate scientists hardly dared to say anything about the relationship between extreme events and climate change. But you have had a number of cases now. Sandy is, of course, a more difficult one. But for example, the floods in Pakistan, the heat waves in Russia, where many climate scientists now said, without climate change, this wouldn't have happened in that scale. So there's more and more, let's say, a footprint of climate change which you can detect even by scientists or in the work of scientists. And of course, we will see how this materializes in the next IPCC report, which will come out end of 2013 and early 2014. And yeah, I'll leave it like that. I'm happy for any questions.
End of 2013.
That's the first part of the report, and then early 2014, that's the parts on the impacts and also on the mitigation strategies.
Okay, we can open the floor to questions from people in the room, and then we'll move on to questions that are coming in online.
Last time round we talked about the conclusions, which is kind of mandate, which is exactly the same as the year before. So do you have any comment about it? What can we expect with such a mandate in hand?
I think partially Wendel already addressed it, that the EU is really, well, it's coming with nothing more or less to Doha, and I think that's really seen as a problem also by many other countries. Last week I had a meeting with the LDC chair, and he was also concerned about it, at the same time recognizing that there are even less ambitious countries, which is part of the problem. So what we at least would hope is that some countries are stepping beyond perhaps the council mandate, as I addressed in finance, that the ministers have opportunities to make statements, to make commitments which go beyond the EU position. Maybe it's a bit more difficult when you're negotiating on text, but so we hope that some more positive signals come from many of the EU countries. But it's, of course, the EU is in a very weak position in Doha, and that's not very unfortunate.
Yes, just to add to that, I mean, I think that the EU is currently lacking a vision on many issues, but also on how to move forward the climate change negotiations. And so, as long as they don't have a common vision on how to move forward, I am afraid that it will be hard for the international negotiations to move forward. Because the EU has always played an important role, and if they can't play that role, then at the moment there's no one else that can fill that gap.
Do you expect anything from the ECOFIN Council tomorrow about this financing?
The expectations are fairly limited. Not know whether you or whether Mira can of course reply to it on the time if you want.
Yeah. We're fearing that the
EU has backtracked on some of the elements that were in the initial draft for the ECOFIN. For example, one of the things that we were looking at was the EU at least clearly stating what it would do in terms of climate finance after 2012, when the fast start finance period is over. And in the initial drafts, there was some bracketed language that the EU would retain at least the fast start levels of finance after 2012, but unfortunately these were removed. So which is bad news, because we don't know what the scale of financing would be from the EU side and how it plans to scale up to its share of the 100 billion. The one good element that is there, which wasn't there in the first draft that we saw, hopefully we think this will stay in there, is that the Commission, at least from what we know, Commissioner Hedegaard's cabinet pushed for language on the EU ETS aviation revenues to be used for climate finance for developing countries. So that is something that was in the May Council conclusions, and it was removed from the initial drafts of this one, but it's back in, so that's one saving grace.
What is so weak in this mandate apart from AAUs, because there's actually no position to what they would say, but what's more is so weak in this mandate that you say that EU is out with nothing?
Well, it's weak in the sense that it's fairly vague and doesn't really address many of the issues. I mean, the finance issue is not being really addressed by the environment ministers, but it's pushed towards the ECOFIN Council. It just reiterates the 20% emission reduction target. It didn't found a compromise on AAUs. So, as the, I don't know your name, but as the previous question was, it doesn't really differ from any of the other positions that the EU took in the past, and they don't really drive forward, like the issue of equity, which is going to be fairly important. If we want to move the Durban negotiations forward, the EU should develop its own position on what exactly they are, how they interpret equity, because they currently speak about this spectrum of commitments and all these relatively vague words where nobody knows what the EU really wants, and it's going to be fairly difficult for the other countries to react to that.
Any more questions in the room?
Just perhaps a proper question about it, but about the trading system. I think in Ghana, the Environment Committee will talk about that this afternoon as well. We're going to be there. And is that really a way forward? Or I'm not an expert, but you hear a lot about fraud. You hear a lot about that doesn't really work as supposed to, and sort of organised crime using it to extend their fraud schemes and so on. So. Is it tainted, or do you think it's well secure and it's a good way forward to develop it? I mean, with airline revenue, for example.
Well, there's a couple of problems with the emission trading scheme, of which the issue of fraud, etc. I mean, I'm not that well into those issues, but we are told by the Commission that they kind of secured those elements. I think the main problem with the emission trading scheme at the moment is that the level of ambition also there is way too low, and so you have way bigger supply than demand, which makes that the price has collapsed. So the price is currently around €6 a ton, while it is foreseen that it should be at least 15 and probably way beyond 25, 30 euros a ton to make real impact on decisions on investments, which is its purpose. But given there is an oversupply of emissions, it doesn't drive anything at the moment. And that needs to be tackled. The Commission, as you know, has this proposal for a backloading, which would postpone the auctioning of allowances from the beginning of the third trading period to the end. That could have some impact, but it would be fairly limited because it doesn't reduce the oversupply as such. So we are expecting that the Commission on Wednesday will come with a number of ideas on how to really structurally reform the emission trading scheme, which is needed, because without structural reform it will not play a real role. It is there, but it doesn't play a role as a tool to drive climate policy. And so the proposals on Wednesday will be too late. I mean, it should have happened already now, but we're hoping that there's some good proposals in that and that there's going to be a timeline to really tackle the emission trading scheme.
Do we have any more questions?
Perhaps an additional point which I think is important, which partly ties into the problems of the EU, but also some of the opportunities. In Durban, the deal was basically decided because of the coalition of EU with the small island states, with least developed countries, with the African group. My sense is that it would be still very important to further consolidate this let's say, partnership, alliance, is perhaps not the most appropriate word, for the future, which is quite important for the negotiation until 2015. There are, of course, a number of issues where EU and LDCs and AOs have, let's say, at least a common idea what they want. Of course, things like AAU, there is not agreement within the EU, let's say, to go the right way. But further building up this coalitions, I think, is quite important. Of course, the EU has some difficulties to do this in Doha because of the weak positions. But I sense that within these groups, within the LDCs, they still appreciate that there's an opportunity for further cooperation and building this up. And as well, I think trying to find more common ground with countries like China, India, South Africa is quite important. I have a bit of concern that some in the EU, and I also know it from some of the German debates, are looking to the US, knowing the US won't really move, at least we don't expect this, and using this as an excuse not to move themselves as well. But I think the bigger potential for the future negotiation lies in trying to find more common ground with these other developing countries. And Wendel mentioned the issue of equity. If the EU is coming forward with some good ideas and proposals there, this can also help building common ground with India or with other developing countries. So I think you should still have a strategy how to move this forward in Doha and beyond.
Could you just repeat what countries are expected to commit to the second Kyoto Protocol?
So, in principle, the 27 EU member states, Norway, Switzerland, and Australia, and then it's unclear, but very likely Ukraine and maybe one or two other former Soviet states like Kazakhstan, etc. But that's very, very unclear.
No confirmation that Russia won't do it?
There is not a formal confirmation that Russia won't do it, because there is still a debate ongoing in Russia, because there is definitely an interest from some sectors in Russian industrial circles to continue to use the oversupply that they probably will have anyway, also in the second commitment period, to sell on the international market. So, but in general, what we know is that Putin is not very positive towards the Kyoto Protocol. So it depends on some of the internal discussions in the Russian government. But yeah, I think it's unlikely they will join, but it's not excluded.
Once they don't join the group of the second commitment countries, they lose the AU's.
Well, it's another part of the discussion. Also within the EU, they don't have a fixed position on whether countries that will not join a second commitment period will still have the right to make use of the flexible mechanisms that are provided in the Kyoto Protocol, which relates to both the possibility for Russia, for instance, if they don't have a commitment, whether they will be able to sell their leftover emission allowance, but also the other part of the discussion is, for instance, whether Japan will be able to make use of the clean development mechanism. So there are a number of discussions. There's a group of EU countries that say, well, if you're not taking on a commitment, then you of course can't make use of the flexible mechanisms. Others see it more something that we should ensure that those mechanisms remain. They are way better, particularly for the clean development mechanism, they are better than potential mechanisms that Japan would develop themselves and so on. So there is a discussion about the value, but in principle, the can position is that countries who are not part of a second commitment period should not make use of the flexible mechanisms. Because either you're in or you're out, but you can't have the best of both worlds.
So a more general question in terms of, you call for more commitment and ambition from the EU member states, but in terms of specific countries like, say, Poland, and the voting mechanism and the fact that it's, it seems to be on a consensus basis, is there something you could say in terms of that? And does the EU need to change the way it currently seems to make decisions on climate change negotiations?
But it's clear that the way that the Council conclusions are being adopted, which is by unanimity because of tradition, there is no legal basis as such that it should be on the basis of unanimity, but it gives every single country the ability to veto, which is not a good way forward, because it has proven that Poland has been able to block a number of decisions. It's clear that many, if not all, of the EU member states do not really want to change that, because they are thinking, well, one day we might want to use the veto, not necessarily in climate change, but in general on all kinds of issues, so they are not prepared to give that away. But I think the EU needs to move forward. It has qualified majority voting for any legislative proposal that comes from the Commission, so I think that should be the rule for all decisions within the EU. On the issue of AAUs, that is not going to be the solution. There it's not only Poland, it's also the other Eastern European countries. So I think on the issue of AAUs, there is a collective responsibility for all the member states, the Eastern European, but also the 15 original EU member states, to find solutions which take into account the reality of all the countries in the EU. So I think decisions by unanimity are not a good way forward, and they should change, but I think it's not going to go easily. But that doesn't mean that the concerns of a group of countries always need to be taken into account and solved.
The question is linked to the fact that it's a shared responsibility with the member states, and the solution in the Council has been solved. Who is leading what, when the kind of mandate that should be adopted? It's a conclusion of the Council. It's not a real mandate, it's a conclusion of the Council. But this discussion is still going on with all international agreement in the Council. It's a question of more institutional question.
Yeah.
As far as I know.
It is an institutional question.
Any more questions in the room? Move to the first online question. I think it's been partially answered, but we'll see if we can provide some more clarity. It asks, ECOFIN, which for non-EU geeks is the meeting of finance ministers from all over the EU. And the next meeting is tomorrow, when they'll be deciding on climate finance position for Doha. ECOFIN will not endorse the EU's position to retain climate finance to fast start levels after 2012. Sorry, we're having a little furniture movement. ECOFIN will not endorse the EU's position to retain climate finance to fast start levels after 2012. How will this impact Doha? Sven, do you want to?
Well, partly it has already been addressed that this is definitely not bringing the EU with a very positive position to Doha where they can make substantial commitments. And I think this will also be recognized by parties, in particular by developing countries coming to Doha, that the EU will not be able to make a joint commitment, or is at least not likely to do so. So what we definitely, it still would be great if the language would come in there somehow, because we know that it has been supported by some member states and also by some of the powerful member states. but as the person already said, it's unlikely. So what we at least would need is that some of the countries who are going to provide more finance than they did so far, and who have already made their budget allocations, like EU, for example, like Germany, like UK, and hopefully many others, that they are using the ways they have in Doha through the minister statements or other ways, that they make clear finance commitments for the next years. This ideally should also include pledges into the Green Climate Fund. But I think there will have to be hard negotiations over any language which ensures that finance scales up over the next years. Whether this will then finally just be a kind of work program with some clear options to work on in order to scale up finance, or any other solution, I cannot foresee yet, but I think it's clear that from developing countries side, they will not just accept too vague language saying there might be additional climate finance or there might be some climate finance beyond 2012. I cannot imagine this. So it will definitely be difficult negotiations around it.
Okay. And then we have one final question, which I think also has been at least partially answered, if not fully answered. How's the EU mandate slowing down negotiations? I assume that refers to their mandate for...
Well, the problem is that the negotiations are slow anyway.
Yeah.
And if we really want to make progress, we need a number of countries that are prepared to move kind of out of their safe zones and take the spiral up again, because we need countries to make a first step forward if others want to follow. If all the countries are waiting for each other to make a first step, nobody will move. And so we need some countries to move forward. And Europe has played an important role, so many countries are looking at Europe, including the small island states and the least developed countries that work together with Europe in Durban. They are expecting some leadership there, which we are not seeing. So in that sense, Europe is not necessarily slowing down the negotiations, but they're not necessarily helping it to move forward.
Okay. Well, I think that's it for our online questions. If there are no more questions in the room, then I think we can wrap things up. Thanks to everyone for participating, those of you who participated online, as well as everyone who came here today. Thanks to our speakers, Wendel Trio and Sven Harmeling. I'm Vanessa Bulkach, Communications Manager at CAN Europe. If you have any further questions, you can always contact me via the CAN Europe website. All my information's on there. So thanks to everyone for coming.